Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's webcast, 3 Things Security Pros Do to Protect Against Ransomware. All right, let's run through the agenda real quick. First of all, we're going to start off with today's challenges, the challenges everybody is facing. Then we'll talk about the 3 protection points. Ananth and Justin will go back and forth on those. Finally, we'll finish up with some case studies and how you can evaluate your risk posture, and then on to the question and answer section. Let me introduce our speakers. First off, we have Ananth. He is the Chief Strategy Officer for Neturian. With an extensive background in product development and operations for telecom network management, he has consulted for many companies on their compliance strategy, audit policy, and automated reporting processes. Ananth is a leading expert in IT security and compliance with over 25 years of experience in IT control and operations, and he speaks quite frequently on these topics. He's also the co-founder and CEO of Event Tracker, a subsidiary of Neturian that delivers security information and event management solutions that combines machine learning and managed services. Also, Justin Vaughan-Brown is the VP of Product Marketing for Deep Instinct. Justin has 20+ years of technology experience and brings solutions to the market with Cisco, AppDynamics, Software AG, and Microsoft, amongst others. He is the author of multiple strategy papers and a recent ransomware ebook. And he has spoken at many industry events around the globe in his capacity as the digital transformation lead, DevOps evangelist, and CMO. Justin is focused on sharing the business and human value of deep learning in preventing cyber attacks. All right, well, thank you everybody once again for joining us, and now I'm going to turn it over to Ananth.
Thank you, David. Good day, everybody. So there are 3 points to consider when we think about ransomware. And of course, ransomware is a pernicious problem. It is pervading all industries, all verticals, all parts of the globe, and also every level of company. It used to be that only the big boys had to worry about it. But if you're on the internet now, you are definitely a potential victim of ransomware. So the challenges to defending against this, easier said than done. One is the nature of the game changes constantly. It is an arms race. And everything that you might have deployed in the past, the bad guys have found a way to evade, detect, and get by. The second problem, of course, is the global scarcity of cybersecurity expertise. How many people can you find and keep that are up to speed on this stuff? So this tends to become a challenge for companies that are looking to defend against this. And then last but not the least, especially with COVID, we've seen a proliferation of services. We're now partly on premise, partly at home, partly in the cloud, partly in SaaS. And so the attack surface has in fact grown. Where do you think you're most vulnerable? How do you protect what your needs are? So we're going to talk about 3 ways in which you can actually you get ahead of this game. The first one of which is to level up your game insofar as the endpoint is concerned, because that's really where a lot of the attacks are occurring or have occurred. To help us to think through that, here's Justin from Deep Instinct, who has a particular expertise in this area. Justin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ananth. That's wonderful. Thank you. So very, very pleased to be joining this webinar and taking you through the Deep Instinct story and how we can help. So let's just go to the next slide here. Thank you. Great. So my real focus here is I would like to talk about how you can level up your prevention game, improve your capabilities, and protect your business in an extremely challenging time. And the reason why it's challenging is the threat landscape as we see it is evolving a lot. I'm sure you're all aware that you're seeing multiple attacks in the news, but we did some research over the last year or so to a group of CISOs and below and SecOps professionals in general. And also, it's interesting, we observed some fascinating data provided by the Ponemon Institute. And the first thing that really stood out, which was from a Ponemon study, was nearly 2/3 were saying that time was the biggest inhibitor to stopping them preventing a cyber attack. It's the critical element there is that simply those attacks are happening too quickly, and we'll drill into that a little bit later in terms of exactly why speed matters. One of the other things that they were sharing was also that an average of 80% of successful breaches are the new or unknown or zero-day attacks, ones that have never been seen before, the ones that signatures and heuristic-based technologies aren't so good at catching just because they're not familiar with them. And then lastly, the other key statistic which I found was fascinating was in terms of those ransomware attacks, less than a quarter were actually dealing with those at what we call the prevention stage, before the attacker has got hold in your environment and causing damage, before they're actually encrypting files and exfiltrating data. But the last key point that I want to highlight was that as much as we're seeing in the news a lot of these stories in terms of ransomware and other attacks, the technologies that are out there right now simply aren't passing muster. They're not cutting it. And one study that we ran back in June of this year, a global study, we found that 84% of everyone that we surveyed felt that the tools that were available in the cybersecurity space right now are not simply up to scratch, and that they could improve. They really needed to raise their game, to Ananth's point. And when we look at the concept of speed here, in terms of a typical ransomware attack, I'm sure some of you are familiar with this, but I think it's still worth highlighting, is that there are a number of stages when an innocent employee or someone at home accidentally clicks on, whether it's a PDF, an Excel file, something that may have already on their laptop at home, an email, a file that's shared maybe in a folder. And it unleashes a number of things. First of all, literally within 1.5 seconds, already the worms that are infecting that environment have already begun to wreak havoc. They're launching multiple new infections, spreading out across those systems and networks. And in less than 2 minutes, pretty much we're seeing over 80% or so of the systems and network are already infected. They're already in trouble. And in parallel, there's the encryption as well. So less than 3 seconds, pretty much already those infections in parallel are actually shutting off your systems and stopping those being available or functioning. And literally within 2 minutes or 120 seconds, what we would call the patient zero is simply inaccessible. You can't even touch it. Already, you literally have no steps further to take to remedy the situation. And for those who are using EDR solutions, they absolutely have a role to play in terms of detection and response and forensics. But they're primarily about investigating a threat once it's already taken hold, post-execution. And then ultimately what you're dealing with is the fact that your systems are going to be pretty much encrypted. You're going to get a nasty email from the ransomware bad folks, first of all, asking for a lot of money in return for a decryption key. And now what is happening a lot is double extortion. Once you've settled, a month or two later, you're finding that, guess what? They've exfiltrated some key sensitive data relating to employees or partners or customers that they're going to publish on the dark web unless you pay them some more money. So it's an extremely challenging situation, but it's happening very, very quickly. And in many cases, organizations are panicking because they simply don't know what to do next. Now focus on Deep Instinct and why we're different and how we can help. So the first thing of all is that we are based on the concept of deep learning, which is the most advanced form of artificial intelligence. And I'm not going to give you a whole deep or lengthy story or explanation of deep learning in this webinar, but what I'd like to highlight is you're probably already using it, whether you're viewing a movie or a TV show on Netflix or YouTube. You're leveraging their recommendation engines, which are deep learning driven, or Tesla with autonomous cars, or Google and Amazon with their speech recognition or neuro-linguistic programming. All of these globally innovative companies are using deep learning. However, when it comes to actually applying the concept of deep learning and the unique framework that we've developed for cybersecurity, we are the only company doing this, that we've been developing this since 2015. And using the deep neural network approach, we're able to detect whether a malicious or a non-malicious threat is coming into your environment with an incredible level of efficacy and efficiency. We're simply far more accurate than any other solution because of this deep learning driven approach. In parallel, we're also able to anticipate threats that have never been seen before because we intrinsically understand the DNA of those attacks. And lastly, you're getting the benefit of all this incredible power, yet you're at a very, very light footprint, less than 1% CPU, extremely lightweight agent that's minimally invasive to your existing environment. So you're getting the best of both worlds. So some of you may have seen in the press that cybersecurity has moved from what I would call the traditional AV heuristics and signature-based approaches to a lot of security solutions being machine learning driven. And machine learning can absolutely bring a lot of value in a number of ways. However, when we look at the technical side of things, in terms of the efficacy and the way machine learning is driven versus deep learning, there are some big differences which ultimately extrapolate out to accuracy. So first starting point here is that machine learning based approaches usually only use about 2% of the available data, not very much. Whereas deep learning ingests 100% of all the available raw data that it sucks in. So it's pulling in more information, more key data points to make sense of. And next, and probably this is the most important one here, is that in terms of machine learning, you actually need a domain expert to build those models and categorize and label, and what's called feature engineering, determining which are the key features you should be looking for, and then ultimately build a model following that. So a little bit like, say, for example, if you had a machine learning system that was designed to tell the difference between dogs and cats, it would have certain metrics there and sizes and ratios, for example, relating to the dogs or cats and their eyes or ears, because they have different proportions to try and look for those. However, with deep learning, it's far more autonomous, it's far more intuitive, it's far denser, and that means ultimately it's much harder to hack. It's much harder for the bad actors to reverse engineer an approach that's machine learning based versus deep learning. So ultimately, you have a greater level of protection and greater level of efficacy there. And the last point here is that we've been seeing a number of benchmarking studies that we've been running, that there are certain types of attacks or file types and so forth that our deep learning based approach is particularly good at relative to machine learning ones. So for example, portable executables, for example, Word docs, PDFs, and Word docs and so forth, all of those, we're finding we're much, much stronger at catching those, that other technologies are simply letting those pass. The ultimate net of this is that our unknown threat accuracy is incredibly high. It's over 99%. And critically, we're stopping those threats pre-execution, before they're written to disk, before the encryption can start. And we do that because we're doing it incredibly quickly, sub 20 milliseconds. That's faster than a human eye blinks. It's 10 times faster than what is commonly regarded as real time. And also critically, in order to make that decision as to whether a file, for example, is benign or malicious, we don't need to send the data to the cloud to make a decision and then wait for it to come back. We can make that immediately. And again, that saves critical time. Again, is far more accurate. And lastly, we're getting a little bit where the air is thin. We've also started building in resilience to what's called adversarial ML attacks, where the bad actors are starting to basically insert malicious content into an overall benign file and hide it and make it very, very difficult for the machine learning based engine to detect that, because it's created a little bit of noise and it's confused it. So in terms of this coverage, we talked about what we're particularly good at stopping. I think it's just worth quickly walking through our capabilities here. And we have a very, very broad range of attack vectors that we can protect you against, both files and also fileless malware. We're particularly good, for example, in terms of covering shellcode injection based attacks, ransomware. We've actually written an ebook recently on this, and we'd be happy to send you this after the webinar. But we have, for example, in terms of ransomware, a multi-layered approach that enables us to prevent each subsequent wave of the same attack. Where it's tried to enter at one point, we can stop it. And then when it's tried to enter another way, we again stop it. And we always have another way of preventing that attack. To use the analogy, if someone was trying to invade a castle and you only had boiling oil to throw over the invading soldiers, we have bows and arrows, we have fire, we have a moat, we have multiple ways of stopping that attack instead of the one swing at the ball, which many solutions do. Now, in terms of that story, I was just chatting through in terms of a typical attack where an unwitting employee or person at home clicks on a malicious file and unleashes a whole story of woe here. I just wanted to showcase, just as a little bit of evidence, the typical attacks that we can start, going from the arbitrary shellcode execution to credentials dumping with LSAS and so forth, behavioral analysis, and both static and behavioral, as you can see here. So we have both static and behavioral to be able to understand at each stage of the attack what is happening and prevent it. And here I just want to highlight a number of attacks that you probably will have seen in the press, some just globally across multiple different industries. Obviously, you will have heard of, for example, Tata, maybe, or TravelX, and more recently, Kaseya. What I've just done here is just listed the type of ransomware attacks or the families that have been used, and just highlight that we would have stopped all of these. With our research laboratory based in Tel Aviv, we've gone back and looked at each of these, and we validated that our deep learning based D-Brain, our engine there, would have absolutely stopped each of these attacks. And we're frequently, on an ongoing basis, tracking multiple attacks. We literally just published a blog on Lockbit 2.0 yesterday, and I've just put here an example of the Hafnium attack and our analysis on it, again from Maxim Smolyansky, who's one of our research lab leads there based in Tel Aviv. So we're very much constantly tracking each attack and understanding their nature, and deconstructing and explaining how deep learning and deep instinct in particular would have stopped that. And just to wrap up before I hand back to Ananth, I'd just like to highlight, in terms of a proof point, we've recently been validated by SE Labs in their Q2 study for enterprise endpoint protection, receiving the full AAA 100% rating. So I'd be very, very happy to share that with you. Just to, again, reassure you that validation that there's been external independent benchmarking in terms of our capability and absolutely validating our efficacy and our proof points there that I've just walked through. But thanks for your time. I'm now going to hand back to Ananth. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. So folks, the first and most important thing that you can do to protect against ransomware is to level up at your endpoints. As Justin pointed out, signature-based stuff is day before yesterday's defense. This is what's been there in antivirus technology for a long time. Even machine learning stuff, which some of these folks tout, is frankly yesterday's solution. Today's solution is around deep learning, which is significantly improved from machine learning. And that's the first most important thing that you can do to protect your network against ransomware. Of course, there is no cigar if you don't cover all of your assets, wherever they may be. And we're in COVID times, which means your assets have probably gone, some of them have gone home, some of them have gone to the cloud, some of them are in SaaS solutions, depending upon the mobile technology that your institution prefers. You got all sorts of flavors. Gone are the days when people would show up at the office with your Windows desktop. Now you might in fact have a Chromebook. Your servers might be based on Red Hat Linux. Android might be a thing. Certainly Windows in various forms. And of course, Mac OS, which is growing in popularity. So can your endpoint solution solve for all of these? Because if you don't solve them for all of the OSs, anywhere they're located, and any kind of threat, whether it's from the PE files or its shellcode or its PowerShell, why then no cigar? So what Justin showed is if you want a comprehensive solution across all of your endpoints, you really do need to level up. And that's the first most important thing that you can do in order to get your game up to speed. David, if you could move us to the next slide. While it's very important for us to be able to cover it, everything that we talked about here was left of boom. The boom is that red thing that you see. I think we went forward by one, David, so we need to go back by one. And it's of course the best, cheapest way in which we can defend is to be in advance of the breach. So if we can predict that the attack is going to occur, or we can prevent it with something like a deep instinct, then we should really do that. And that's where left of boom kind of activities assume great value. The earlier in the cycle you can actually prevent this, the better off you are, because you don't have to do detection and response. But then perfect protection is not practical. And so also 24/7 monitoring is necessary. And you have to look past the endpoint, because your attack surface is really more than the endpoint. And that's point number 2 of the 3-step process to get control of ransomware. So if you can go to the next slide, you'll see that we have to think about the entire attack surface. It's not just your endpoints, wherever they may be, whatever flavor they may be, but it's also your network, which could be on-prem, which could be in the cloud. It's also assets that you may have in the cloud, AWS perhaps, Azure, maybe public or private cloud. And certainly we're all using SaaS applications, are we not? Maybe Microsoft 365, Salesforce, all sorts of other stuff is part of our attack surface. And people. You have remote workforce, you have folks that are not directly in your organization, maybe in your supply chain. You have to worry, because of remote access, about anomalous login. Is that login from Timbuktu normal for you? Do you really have an employee in Timbuktu? Can you detect that that sort of a thing has occurred, and is that out of ordinary? Well, the solution from Event Tracker includes a core platform, which includes SIM and the deep learning endpoint protection that Justin spoke about, but it also deploys security controls on top, including IDS, network traffic analysis, vulnerability management, and all of it delivered as a managed service, so that you don't have to layer on that scarcely available security resource. You don't have to do this for a living. You can focus on your core business. So point number 2 is to protect your entire attack surface. If we can go to the next slide, please, David, you'll see that the problem of protecting from ransomware, spans not just the deep learning stuff that we talked about here, or even the 24/7 stuff, but needs to be comprehensive. The entire scope from left of boom, meaning you predicted because of vulnerability, you prevented because of deep learning, and if you couldn't do either of those, you detected. And then if you detected, then you must remediate. All of these things need to be available in the mix in order for you to have proper protection against ransomware. Let's go to the next slide. And so you'll see that there are a variety of things. Many cases, the challenge here for some of our buyers is that it's a confusing situation, don't know quite where to start, can't figure out how to staff up. But what we've done is taken a lot of that guesswork out, and our team is organized in order to provide you protection across all of these layers. Since this is all we do, we're not going to get into your banking business, we're not going to be an education group, we're not going to do anything finance or anything healthcare. That is you, Mr. Customer. Our focus is entirely around security. So we can think about this morning, noon, and night. We can staff for it. And indeed, the way we've staffed for it is we've put people in different buckets in order to make sure that they are specialists in this area. And they can bring that kind of tiger onto your team. So you need to think about all 4 aspects of protection. And this, again, is point number 2. Let's move on to point number 3 and to the next slide. And we'll see more about how we are able to provide you this, this kind of protection. Of course, this is all being done 24/7. On your behalf. That in itself is half the problem, because the bad guys are usually awake when you're not, because they're not necessarily operating in your time zone, you see. So this is all very well and good, but what is it actually done? Well, it's been in production for several years now. As a result, we have several thousand MSPs and several hundreds of thousands of endpoints under protection. And if your question is, that's great, but I'm from Missouri and I want you to show me, well, I invite you to our website, netsurian.com, where we publish these things that we call Catch of the Day. And these are little vignettes to show you examples in your particular vertical, maybe with your particular technology, how this service, marrying this deep instinct solution with deep learning, along with the 24/7 SOC, actually provides you value. So here's one of those then. A major retailer in the United States with about 2,500 employees and about 100+ stores spread across the 4 time zone, distribution centers, and so on. They had managed threat protection at HQ, but they had continued with their legacy antivirus at all of their stores. What is it that happened? Well, our 24/7 SOC detected a suspicious PowerShell command followed by a name pipe. So what happened here is that our 24/7 folk that are paying attention to this stuff and can recognize evil when they see it jumped into the fray and were able to say, wait a minute, that doesn't look quite right. What's that all about? So when the detailed investigation followed, it turned out that the attacker was using a legitimate IT tool and waiting for the payload to be released. This, by the way, is called living off the land. You know, they know, the bad guys know that if they catapult something new into your universe, then your defense is probably going to catch it and prevent it. And so they try to use tools like PowerShell that are legitimate in your environment, that are already built into the Microsoft OS, that are used for Windows Update as a way of doing their dirty work. So what was the fix in this case? Well, if you see something, you need to say something, right? That's what the SOC did. Alerted the customer promptly to the compromise, and that prevented it from metastasizing. And really, frankly, that's a win. I know we sometimes think that it's a win only if you prevented it, but it really doesn't matter in the entire kill chain. If you can prevail anywhere and prevent the bad guys from exfiltrating data or accomplishing their evil work, then you've won and they've lost. They have to actually win at every point along the way. You have to win at any one point along the way, whether you predicted it or you prevented it or you detected it and you remediated. All of that works in your favor. They, on the other hand, lose anywhere along the way and they're done. And so you need to take advantage of that. I know there is a narrative that says, oh, well, the bad guys have it easy. You know, they get 1,000,000 tries and they can, you know, succeed only once. Whereas we, the good guys, must succeed 1,000,000 times. If we lose even once, then we've lost and they've won. Yeah, that might be true. But think about what win means. Win means they not only penetrate your network, but they manage to get in, get the data, and get out. So anywhere in the kill chain, if you're able to prevail, then you won and they've lost. And that's what happened in this case. Even though they hadn't chosen to level up their prevention game, as we told you, is your first step towards protecting from ransomware. So you can get a belt and suspenders, because the worst case scenario is that your pants fall down, and we don't want that, do we? So if you can go to the next slide, I'll show you one more example from our collection. And this is all being updated on our website. You're welcome to come there and take a look, and you'll find, you know, many different kinds of catch of the day from many different customers in many different verticals. This one is a well-known problem called Emotet. And in this particular case, our customer was an MSP, and in turn, their customer was in healthcare. They had installed it on about 900 endpoints in a community health network somewhere up there in the Northeast. Frankly, what happened here was the attacker had done some social engineering. They had determined that there was an open position at the website of that company, and they had sent in a specially crafted resume, a Microsoft Word.doc file, which had malware as part of the scripting. And the way they had done the document was, it kind of fooled the HR person into saying, this file is protected by McAfee, click here to see the file. And that click here, what it really did was it enabled macros. You know, by default, Microsoft Office 365 now disables macros. And so they wanted to fool the unsuspecting HR person into enabling macros in this file. Now, the HR person is not a technical guy, right? So he sees this and he thinks to himself, well, I have a security conscious applicant here, though this must be all right. And innocently clicks on the enable, thinking he's enabling McAfee. Of course, he isn't. He's enabling macros. And when that macro gets enabled, all of a sudden that piece of evil starts to take effect. Now, if you've got legacy antivirus, and that's what they had at the time, they hadn't leveled up their endpoint game, this thing just went by that antivirus, even though it was up to date, like it was nothing. You know, and now because that macro is disabled, if the resume looks somewhat legitimate to that poor HR person, they might actually forward it internally to the hiring manager saying, hey, I've received an application for the position that you had open on the website. And now because it comes from a trusted source inside, the stupid thing propagates laterally. How evil is that, right? They've fooled the poor HR person through social, and now they've made him do their dirty work for him. And this was Emotet. So what happened in this particular case? We were able to identify it because it started to chat with a well-known bad IP. We were able to identify it because the MD5 hash of that particular file was considered to be unsafe by our event tracker solution. The better thing for them to do would have been to level up their protection game and have deep instinct with deep learning at the endpoint. As Justin mentioned, deep learning is especially good with PowerShell, especially good with Microsoft Word, especially good with PE files, which is the bulk of what you're going to get when you get these kinds of attacks. And if you can prevent it, then you're not depending upon the detection and remediation. They had that because it's never perfect protection, is not practical, as we said, and so they got saved. And so, as I've said to you, the first two steps, you want to get serious about ransomware, level up your endpoint game, and then don't assume. Making an assumption makes an ass out of you and me. Monitor it 24/7. I know that this is extremely hard to do for a particular organization. That's why we're here. That's all we do. We're not allowed to take Christmas off. We're not allowed to take the weekend off because we're busy on that wall. And really, you do need us on that wall. So step number 2, you want to protect against ransomware. Don't assume that your defenses did the job. Monitor to make sure that you've got what you need. David, can we go to the next slide, please? And so those are 2 examples for you of how the monitoring service worked out. So we promised you 3 steps, right? And the reality is that in that diagram that I showed you about breach, we love to predict because that's the cheapest way of fending off attacks. You can patch and not be vulnerable. We would, if you couldn't do that, we would love to prevent. Because of deep learning, we're able to prevent better, faster, with greater accuracy. And by the way, that's a thing, because one of the problems you've got with these hair trigger endpoint solutions is they'll give you false positives. They'll block stuff that they shouldn't really be blocking. And in the process, they will prevent you from getting your legitimate work done. That's actually a thing to note. And it's another area where this solution shines over some of the competition. If you couldn't block it and the breach occurred, can you catch it before it causes any damage? That was point number 2. But what's the bitter truth? The bitter truth is that making the assumption that that's always going to work no matter what is probably a mistake. There's going to be some situation where all of the prevention in the world somehow didn't meet the objective, and it slipped past the detection, and we couldn't do the remediation in time, and now the ransomware has taken root. What now? Should you fold up your tent and go out of business? Well, not hardly. So that comes to point number 3, is that you need to prepare for the worst. This is called the assume breach paradigm. It's something that we all need to assume and expect. And that should that occur, do you have the means to recover effectively? That means you have an offsite backup of all of your critical data. That means you've tested that process for effectiveness. You haven't put it in place 2 years ago, never bothered to test it, and assume that it's all going to work out. That's certainly not the case. Did you identify what were your high-value risk assets for priority recovery? When the chips are down, some systems are more important to recover than others. Do you know what those are? And can you hop to it in sequence? How about in the times of COVID? Is it possible that if the laptop's gone, the desktop's gone, have you thought about the use of virtual desktop infrastructure maybe, so that you can get your business back on its feet? These are not things that either of us, the Deep Instinct or the Netsurian team, provide, but we did promise you 3 steps to protect against ransomware, and this is an important one. And then, of course, you do have assets, not just in your desktops, not just in your servers, but also in your SaaS applications. Are you prepared to recover from those? So to have a comprehensive solution against ransomware, can we go to the next slide, please? You need to think about all of these 3 points. Point number 1 was you really do need to level up your prevention game. As much as you can predict left of boom, as much as you can prevent left of boom, you really want to do that. Now, given that you can't do that 100% of the time, If it does get through, can you detect and can you respond effectively? By the way, part of that response is to sort of practice your response. When that situation occurs, do you have a playbook that you're going to run? Do you know what you're going to do? If an endpoint is in fact infected for some reason, do you know what your steps are going to be? Well, if you haven't drilled them, if you haven't practiced them, if you haven't written them down, then in the heat of battle, you won't do it. I mean, it's what the Marines say, right? You need to train like you fight, because you're going to fight like you train. So have you trained in advance properly the way you're going to fight? You need to do that. Enhance your capability and know-how so that you can scale your protection. It's no use protecting only the CEO's laptop. Everything in the enterprise, whether it's in the cloud, whether it belongs to the shipping department or it belongs to the engineering team, it needs protection, because the bad guys will get in at the weakest point and then spread laterally. Now, assume breach. If all else fails, make sure that you have a recovery plan and that you have done this. This isn't coming as a result of some paperwork or white paper or anything. This is coming from several years of experience. You heard Justin's bio. He's been doing this for a while. We ourselves have had this service for a long time. And so there is a large number of your fellow MSPs, your fellow partners in business that have used this type of solution for their benefit. I urge you to come to the website and take a look and see for yourself. There are some other assets that the marketing team is prepared to provide you, including the AAA rating from SE Labs, so that you can actually see how did this thing work out in practice instead of just listening to a webinar. Because, like I said, if you're from Missouri like David is, your answer is going to be show me. I want to actually see this. So with that, I'm going to hand this back to David Ellington for our Q&A. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ananth. Thank you also, Justin. We have had a number of questions come in. If you have any other ones, please enter them in the questions tab, and we will get to those as soon as we possibly can. So we're going to start off with this one. We'll start this for Justin. Deep learning looks quite complicated. Does it take time to implement and administer?
That is as a top question. I like that. It does look quite complicated because some parts of it are, which is why we have a bunch of elite data scientists based in Tel Aviv who've been doing this a long time. The good news, however, is that despite the power and the advancement of the technology, in terms of getting up and running and administering and using Deep Instinct, it's actually pretty simple. We have a quick start program that can have users or customers up and running within a week, week and a half or so, and getting their initial value. We have a very proven best practice and a playbook there that we can enact, and in conjunction with Netsurian, have you started. So I wouldn't be intimidated in any way by the deep learning approach. It's very advanced technology, yes, but it's incredibly simple and straightforward to configure and set up and use. So good news there.
That is great to hear. Thank you so much, Justin. Ananth, we had one come in. I think you can answer this. Are there any other suggestions for getting my executives to move beyond legacy antivirus?
Any other suggestions? Well, as we said, you really do need to level up and not think that machine learning by itself, because a lot of the legacy antivirus people are now offering machine learning. But the problem with that approach is they're going to have to shuffle the executable, the thing in question, up to the cloud for some explosion in the sandbox and some decision, and then turn it around and pass the decision down. You know, lots of traditional antivirus types actually do this, and they tout it as machine learning. It's all very well and good, but the fact of the matter is it's not practical. As Justin showed you, the attack's occurring in 20 seconds in real time. So what are you doing? You're moving the executable up there, depending on your network connection, waiting for it to explode, looking at it, making a decision, sending the decision back. You know, in today's universe, that is bolting the barn door well after the horse has left. It's not going to really be effective. Now, the legacy antivirus really has no choice, because if it wasn't in its heuristic signature-based thing, what else could it do? It can't make a decision, so it must defer the decision to some, you know, central intelligence that's up there. And what do you know about central intelligence? It's neither central nor is it intelligent. So that's not really a good solution. So I would urge those of you that are still hanging on to legacy antivirus, that those days are past. Today's threats landscape has evolved past it. Indeed, because of living off the land, they've become smart as hell. And they are indiscriminate in the sense that they will use the advanced technique even against the little guy, because that's what they do. They don't craft, specially difficult solutions for the big boys and then hit all the little guys with the somewhat technically less sophisticated stuff. Once they've upped their game, they are scattershotting everybody on the internet with that latest game. And so you want your defense to be up to snuff. Anything else, and you're asking for it in the neck, and that's not something that we want to do.
Ananth, I just wanted to add to that. It's a really valid point. What we've been seeing is both a rise in sheer volume of attacks. So that's a lot of it's been driven by, for example, ransomware as a service, which is pretty much using a franchise model, much as McDonald's, Burger King, and Starbucks have had franchise models where they have been working with affiliates who will then carry out those ransomware attacks using the attack families that have been developed, or ransomware families that have been developed by the bad actors, and then paying them a commission, 30–40%, if they're successful and the ransomware is paid, which has absolutely exponentially increased the number of bad actors out there. And in parallel, they've also increased the type of ransomware families. We're just seeing those extrapolating and morphing and changing. So it's almost a perfect storm on the X and Y axis of both increases in the number of attacks and the sophistication. And to Ananth's point, 100%, whether you're a small, medium, or large organization, public sector, government, private, doesn't really matter. You're all fair game.
Right. Yes. I know we have a number of retailers on here, so I think they need to get that opinion definitely drilled into their head. I'm interested to get your answer on this one, Justin, because I have not heard of this myself. What is ransomware as a service?
Yeah, I kind of explained very high level, but what we're seeing is as the bad actors have developed ultimately highly sophisticated families and forms and methods of attack, pretty much these people are like any normal company, except they're illegal. They have daily stand-ups. They have management hierarchies. They have KPIs. Quite often, they have normal offices that you probably wouldn't tell is any different from any other legitimate organization. And ultimately, it's about being profitable and market expansion. So they want to take whatever they've produced and created and federate it and proliferate it as widely as possible. And one of the ways of doing that is pretty much, like we're saying, I think you're all familiar, everyone on this webinar, with what a franchise is. And they're literally then providing that ransomware packaged up for someone then to simply take and then use to actually then carry out the attack. So the person carrying out that attack is in theory legally responsible, but they've been provided with the weaponized files and so forth and etc. by the experts, and then these novices are going ahead and trying their luck. And if they're successful, then contractually, and I say that with a dose of irony, they are then paying, say, 30 to 40 or maybe even 50% of any ransomware paid to the bad actor that developed that particular attack. So imagine if, instead of now the bad actors, instead of one single attack, are now carrying out from what they've developed 20, 30, 40, 50 across multiple industries, multiple geographies. It's massively increasing just the sheer number of attacks. We've seen in the last year and a half, if my memory serves me correct, an increase of 800% in ransomware attacks. It's incredible, and it's ever increasing. So companies, like I said, of all sizes are all potential victims.
I guess, David, another way of looking at it, it's the era of specialization. Remember back in the day, there used to be a healer for the tribe, and then that became a doctor, and we used to call them the family doctor, and you went to them for everything. Well, that became specialized, and you had surgeons that were different than doctors. Well, you've come to the point now that you have a head and neck surgeon. not just a general surgeon. So same with ransomware is that the game has gotten specialized. You have people that specialize in getting into the endpoint. You have people that specialize in payloads. You have people that specialize in actually deploying those. And then you have people that specialize in extracting money and Bitcoin from them. So rather than have one guy do it all, ransomware as a service makes all of this, specially available. And you can come along at any point in the line as a bad actor wannabe, not know how to write this stuff, but benefit from somebody else that does that all day long because you happen to specialize in gaining access to the endpoint. So that's a way to look at this ransomware as a service. Sign of the times, I guess.
With that in mind, Ananth, do you think we should outlaw ransomware payments in the US?
Easier said than done. I think we tried it with something called prohibition back in the 20s. It doesn't really as such work. It didn't work then, not going to work now. The better answer is through education. The better answer is through responsible behavior. The better answer is by catching these criminals and putting them where they belong, back in jail. Did you know that the odds of getting caught as a computer crime kind of guy is significantly smaller than the burglar who comes in with that eye patch and breaks into your house and tries to run away with your iPhone? Simply because this stuff is harder to detect, harder to attribute, harder to prove. And so therefore it's again, because they're online, right? I mean, they're sitting in Timbuktu and they're attacking you. You happen to be online. So this wonderful thing called the internet allows you to get to China in one click. Well, the bad news is it allows China to get to you in that same one click. What are you going to do? Go there and give them what for? So how would you actually punish? It's a nice concept and it fits well with the concept of retribution and justice and so on. But frankly, the best thing you can do is be a hard target. Look, the bad guys are capitalist pigs just like the rest of us, which means they're looking for the sucker. They're looking for the easy mark. They're looking for the soft target. Making them good guys, well, that's their mother's problem, not our problem. We just want to be a hard target. If we harden ourselves with all the things we've talked about today, they show up and they're not able to easily make a sucker out of you. They'll move on. That's a win. We didn't cure them. We didn't make them right. Like I said, that's not really our job. So punishing them, that's law enforcement's problem. If they catch them, they should. How are you going to outlaw this? I don't think that's even practical or possible.
Okay, no, that's fair, understandable. I have a couple more questions here, so if you have any other ones you'd like to add in, now would be the time to enter them in the questions tab. Either one of you, I think, could answer this, but maybe we'll start with Justin. Has the pandemic and work from home caused any attacker changes in tactics that is noticeable?
That is an excellent question. I think the answer, we've seen, I think it's probably contributed to the number of ransomware attacks, but I think there's a couple of consequences of the global pandemic and this hybrid working, even if some folks are now slowly going back into the office. It's that you've got a situation whereby a number of organizations have suddenly, when the pandemic broke, suddenly they weren't obviously letting employees go back to the office. They weren't allowed to. So they had a choice. Either they provision 5, 10,000, 20,000 laptops or and so forth, and maybe to one company that's very much office-based and perhaps just used PCs a lot, but they didn't have a work laptop that they took home or that availability. So they either had to invest millions of dollars potentially in all that extra kit, or they said, you know what, if you've got a laptop or a PC at home or a Mac or whatever you have, you can use that, no problem. But the danger I think has been that heaven knows what is on that laptop, what is on that device, but it hasn't been through the usual corporate or company level security scrutiny. And there just maybe just some bad stuff on that. Maybe someone has websites where they've unwittingly downloaded malware, and then the malware has now got into the company network. So that's one very big area of concern. I think the second one is that SecOps teams are now still working extensively in a remote sense. So you're not getting that collaboration, teamwork, and intelligence shared maybe quite so easily. I think that is one other challenge. And then ultimately there's the long-term one, which is How many people actually go back to the office now? It'll probably never return to exactly how it was. So ultimately now you have more people working from home. You have potential issues around access to certain applications. What should and couldn't they access? Are they the only person using that laptop? If someone says to their child, yeah, you can watch a Netflix movie and just use the work laptop, who knows what else they're going to accidentally click on when the parent isn't there, for example. Just so I think there's a whole bunch of potential issues, and I think it definitely hasn't helped, but I'd love to hear what Ananth has to say.
We've seen a couple of adjustments by the attackers. Number one, because there's such a lot of anxiety about a cure for a pandemic, the lure for phishing emails has changed somewhat. It used to be your Amazon.com delivery has been delayed, or you've been selected for jury duty, or something along those lines. Here's your holiday vacation balance. It's now shifted to things like, here's the COVID cure, or something else that is, clickbait worthy. So certainly one technique that the attackers have adapted to is that. The second is there's been a significant rise in remote access, right? Because you're remote now, that means VPN and those types of solutions, which maybe 5%, 10% of your organization was using, that has suddenly climbed to 90%. And you've probably opened the doors and are allowing remote access to databases, to applications that typically were accessed internally. Now that they're accessible from the outside, maybe a compromised password can lead to those systems being compromised, whereas previously you'd really need to show up on site to do that, which was harder. Things that were expected to be done when you were in the office, and a common one of those is vulnerability scanning. Often the expectation was the laptop's going to be in the office at some point, and so I'm going to scan you with a physical device that's actually on the network. Well, you're never really on the network. How now, brown cow? Do you have a way of scanning you, especially if you don't show up via VPN? In our own organization, some employees are able to function effectively through SaaS applications and things that are hosted outside without ever getting on the VPN. So you're never really part of the company network at any point for 6 months, 9 months, 1 year. If your vulnerability scanning assumed, expected, hoped was dependent on that occurring, it's not occurring now. And if you didn't scan, then you probably didn't patch. And if you didn't patch, then you were vulnerable. And if you were vulnerable, you got attacked. And if you got attacked and then you jumped onto the company network, then you were patient zero. And that's not a good thing. So there have been all of these kinds of changes. IT teams, frankly, in the early days of the pandemic were consumed with efficiency. Can we even work in this environment? So it was all about connectivity. It was all about getting back to business in this crazy universe. Then now, because they've had time to do that, they're pondering what is it that they have to redo in terms of security. Certainly one of it is to level up the prevention game, but there are a number of other things that need to be rethought, since, as Justin pointed out, we're probably never going to put that genie back in the bottle. You're never going to go back to the way it used to be pre-pandemic, where 95% of the people showed up at an office most of the time. Never going to happen again. So therefore, you're in this brave new world, and you have to think about it and adapt for it. The time to say things like, oh, I'm consumed with connectivity, I'm consumed with recovery, that's past. We did that last year. This year, you need to rethink what your security is going to look like with this new normal.
All right. Thank you so much, Ananth. I think we have time for one final question. And this one comes in at, if most threats start on the endpoint, why isn't endpoint security sufficient?
So I would challenge that assumption. I think in 2021, I would say while many threats happen from the endpoint, not all threats happen from the endpoint. I mean, a case in point for our friends in the MSP space is what happened at Kaseya. What happened at Kaseya was that if you happen to have a vulnerable server in your organization and you were hosting the Kaseya remote software, well, that was the target of attack, not the endpoint. And from that starting point, it got distributed to the endpoints. So the fact of the matter is that your attack can occur in the cloud and then get onto the desktop. It can occur at the desktop, through the network, through spam. It can come to you through the USB, which you happened to plug in because you found it in the cafeteria and you said, hey, what's this? I wonder if this has any value, and you plugged it in unthinking. There's all sorts of attack vectors. It isn't appropriate to say to yourself, all of these things originate at the endpoint, therefore I'm going to protect my endpoint and I'm done. I wish it were that simple, but it isn't.
All right, well, that is all the time we have for today. Thank you very much to Ananth. Thank you very much to Justin. All the insight was greatly appreciated.